So let's get started. It's a real honor and good morning, everybody. And I'm Mayor Wade Truxell, of the city of Fort Collins, and I'm here to welcome you to this special conversation about the impacts of COVID-19 and what it means for the future of cities as we recover. We are thrilled to have Dr. Richard Florida. He's been a icon for me over many years, and I've had the opportunity to meet Richard as part of City Lab, and Richard's been in Fort Collins too, presenting to I believe it was a chamber event, and glad to have Richard virtually return to Fort Collins as one of the most renowned urban thought leaders in the world. And much has changed since the last time that we've seen each other, and it was October 2019. And since he was last in Fort Collins, and we're excited to have Dr. Florida's latest work and have that conversation today. And today, joined by members of our Fort Collins City Council, Emily Gorgel. Emily's with us, Julia Pignataro, Ken Summers, Ross Caniff, Susan Gukowski's joined us here, and Kristen Stevens, our Mayor Pro Tem. And we are delighted to have other elected officials join us here today, including State Representative Jenny Arndt. And I should point out they're in session right now, so they're busy in Denver. So Jenny Arndt, and then Sally Anderson, she's on the staff of Congressman Joe Neguse, and then State Senator Joanne Janal, and then James Thompson from Senator Bennett's office is here as well. And we also have present our city manager, who Darren Atterbury, and members of our staff, and many community leaders and partners that we've been working closely during this time of recovery. And as you know, building back and better for our future, for our city and our region, will continue to take a very collaborative effort on all of our parts. And Dr. Florida will share with us his insights for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have questions and answers, a discussion. And for the attendees on Zoom, please put your questions into the chat, and our moderator will help to share as many of those possible during our time together today. And we will start with questions from our elected officials. And I am also most sure that you are familiar with Dr. Richard Florida's influential and inspirational work, which we have looked into and looked for as innovative approaches to investing to make Fort Collins a great place to live, work, play, and enjoy all the way around. And Dr. Florida's books include The Rise of the Creative Class, and most recently, The New Urban Crisis. He is a researcher and a professor, serving as a university professor and director of cities at the Martin Prosperity Institute at the University of Toronto, a distinguished fellow at the New York University Schack Institute of Real Estate, and a visiting fellow at Florida International University. He serves as senior editor for The Atlantic, where he co-founded and serves as editor at large for City Lab. And that's where we've interacted a couple of times. And Dr. Florida has also worked with several in our community, including Jesse Elliott from the Bohemian Foundation, and Dr. Michael Seaman, a professor at CSU. Hi, Michael, see you here. And then Dr. Florida and Dr. Seaman recently published a book published for the Brookings Institute, The Lost Start: Measuring COVID-19's Devastating Impact on America's Creative Economy this year. As a university city, as we are here in Fort Collins, and with learning as a part of our DNA in our community, we're definitely a learning community. We are looking forward to this conversation with Dr. Florida. And please join me in giving a very warm and gracious welcome to Dr. Florida. We're glad that you're here. Thank you so much, Dr. Florida. Yeah.
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks to everyone on the line. Thanks, City Manager, all the representatives, political officials. I feel a close kinship to Colorado and Fort Collins. I've been there. Mike wrote that report, and I put my name on it. Jesse. Funny, I was saying about Jesse. Jesse and I wrote a book together, and we were actually roommates, which I think is hysterical.
Oh.
We lived together at the beach in Delaware for about a month writing that book uh, in a previous life. And he's a force of nature, as is Mike. And I think great days are ahead for Fort Collins in Colorado. I think you're one of the most interesting places around and really positioned for this post-pandemic. I threatened my wife and kids that I may well write a book on the post-pandemic city, but the credit to our scientific community. And by the way, I'm not as down on America as many other people are. I think we showed who we are in the election. And, Americans are strange, as somebody who splits their time between the US and Canada. And Americans don't like to be told what to do. And, we can complain about that all we want, but Americans are Americans and we will be who we are. But I think the real light at the end of the tunnel is this vaccine. I don't, we've miserated about this, but we might look back in this in 5 years, and despite all the tragedy and the loss of life, say we've had one of the greatest public health miracles or scientific miracles of all time. We got a vaccine out under a year, which is it was unthinkable. And we were just talking, Jackie, saying it looks like in your community it should be hitting the stores or whatever, the hospitals, not quite the CVSs and Walgreens, because it's going to go to those healthcare providers. But who knows? Maybe by early in the next year I could actually come see you all. And I do think, because of this crazy American DNA, the US economy is going to rebound very quickly. Americans, we've shown our true colors. I hate to say it. And even some of your colleagues out in California going to restaurants, who will remain nameless, who I adore, by the way, some of my favorite people. But Americans are Americans, and they want to get on with it, take risks. And I think despite some of the stumbles we've made, things are going to, and I probably won't be able to write this darn book on the post-pandemic city because we'll be back to normal before too much longer. Anyway, I prepared a slide deck for all of you. I actually worked on it a little bit this morning, worked on it for the past few weeks with my team, worked on a little bit this morning, talked for about 30 minutes or so, maybe less, and then let's throw it open for questions. So let me see. I've gotten pretty good with Zoom. If I can share my screen, look at that. The technical wonders. I called it the Great Urban Reset. I wrote a book several years ago called The Great Reset. Just wish I had held that back till now. And Mayor, to take your words, to take President-elect Biden's words, let's call it building Fort Collins back better, building a more inclusive and resilient Fort Collins. And that's what we want to talk about. What is the Great Urban Reset? It's more than this COVID-19 pandemic, although the COVID-19 pandemic is a part of it. It's a series of overlapping crises or events, of which the pandemic is one and clearly an accelerant or catalyst. There is the economic fallout from the pandemic on jobs, on unemployment, on small business, and I think most importantly on the fiscal outlook for cities, which is a big deal. And we can talk about that, especially in the Q&A if we want. And then followed by, but I think in part stimulated, clearly the protests, the Black Lives Matter protests for racial and economic equity and inclusion and justice, were reactions to heinous acts of police brutality, as such civil disobedience usually is. But I think the extent of those protests were catalyzed to a degree by the COVID pandemic and the way it reinforced the fault lines of race and class and fell heaviest on racial minorities, the Black and Hispanic community, on frontline workers. But I think the combination of these devastating events actually creates a once-in-a-century opportunity, Mayor, to use your words and President-elect Biden's words, to build back better. I not once in a lifetime, I say this very, very clearly, once in a century. I think the last time we had this kind of opportunity was, in the beginning of the 20th century. We had a big opportunity in the Depression and the World War and in the 60s, but I think this is a bigger one because all of these things are coming together. A new kind of economy, an emphasis on creativity and knowledge, the pandemic and the need for health, what I call the new urban crisis, and the need to look at inequity and affordability and gentrification. And we have a great reset, a moment of great resetting. And the conversation is a lot about big cities. I'll mention that in a moment, but it's not just for big cities. This is a great reset of big and medium and small sized cities, of America's suburbs and of America's rural communities, and of course for Fort Collins. Look, this is not the end of cities. Pandemics and crises seemed in the American context, Richard Hofstadter called it the paranoid style of our politics. It seems like pandemics bring out a gloom and doom chorus, and now look, this is the third gloom and doom chorus I've heard in my life. The first gloom and doom chorus I heard after 9/11, which said that cities were dead and New York was over. The second gloom and doom chorus I heard in 2008. And the third gloom and doom chorus was in the wake of the pandemic. Look, cities will survive, communities will survive. This will be over sooner than we thought. But one of the things that I learned, and Mike and I talked about a lot, as an urbanist, nearly 40 years into a career as an urbanist now, hard to believe. I studied a lot of things. I studied the role of world wars, natural disasters, great fires, great floods, economic crises. No one ever told me about pandemics. It's very interesting. Didn't cover them in an undergraduate course, didn't cover them in a graduate course. I was born during a pandemic. My mom never mentioned it. My aunts and uncles, dozens of them, I'm an Italian American. My parents come from families of 7, most of whom were born or toddlers during the Spanish flu, never mentioned the Spanish flu once. Plagues in Europe, cholera epidemics, tuberculosis. My parents both had the last rites read to them. My dad for scarlet fever, my mom for diphtheria, childhood diseases, the Spanish flu. They didn't alter the arc of urbanization. Urbanization, or this force of clustering that brings human beings together in large cities and metropolitan areas and small cities and communities, is a far greater force than infectious disease. We have continued to cluster through all of human history in the wake of far greater threats to our health and well-being. But this pandemic and this crisis will and is reshaping communities of all shapes and sizes. So a little bit on the pandemic. The COVID crisis reinforces longstanding divides of race and class. Let's take race first. COVID-19 rates of minorities compared to whites, 2.5 to 3 times case rates for African Americans and Hispanic and Latino population, 5 times the hospitalizations, 2 times the deaths for African Americans, and about 10% more for Latino and Hispanic Americans. My once enemy and now new friend, Joel Kotkin, and I may know for you, Joel and I are writing an essay together on the post-pandemic city, which should be out in coming months. We worked together on a project in Bentonville, which was a very good thing for us to do, and showed that although we still have great disagreement, we have fundamental disagreements, there's a lot of commonality in our thinking. But Joel's the one who said the real disease here isn't the virus, it's poverty, and concentrated poverty. So that's what this is showing, the longstanding divides of race and class. Not just a racial divide, we have a divide based on class, the way we work, the kind of work we do. Remote workers, like all of us, can shelter in place, even if we live in terribly dense environments. I'm talking to you today from Miami Beach, Florida, from a condominium building. We have a home in Toronto, single family home in a very dense neighborhood in Toronto, but an even denser part of South Beach. I have not been to a store since March 12th. Not been inside a store. Everything I've needed could be delivered to us here. Pharmaceutical, grocery, packages. But 50 million workers provide essential high-risk frontline jobs, exposed to the pandemic because they work closely with others and they work closely with all of us. Households with greater than $100,000 in income are more than twice as likely as those with 50K, make less than 50K to be able to work remotely. And white workers are more than twice as likely than Black workers or Hispanic workers to be able to work remotely. Race and class have been key factors in the spread of COVID-19. We now know that density has not been a factor in the spread of COVID-19. There was a belief about that. There's a great group of anti-urban people writing about those things. As one pundit said, it's not people per square mile, which was the risk factor, it's people per square foot. It's overcrowded conditions in low-income neighborhoods where people are forced to live cheap by jowl. It's poverty, it's frontline work, and it's race, which have become the key factors. According to our work, we did work on Sweden, believe it or not. A group of scholars at LSE have done work at the United States. Others have done work in big cities. There is no evidence that denser places have been more susceptible in COVID-19 than small towns or rural places. In fact, in the United States, the highest rates of COVID-19 are in North and South Dakota. The virus hit denser cities first, in addition to places like Colorado. and amenity-rich ski slope places in Colorado and the Rocky Mountain West and in Europe, because those places are more globally connected and have more visitors. But denser places and bigger cities have been actually more effective at mitigation, social distancing, and providing effective healthcare. And as I mentioned, the highest per capita rates are in rural places like North and South Dakota. Mike and I were able to take a deep look at COVID-19 and the creative economy. This is mainly Mike's work out of Colorado State University right there in Fort Collins. Mike originally did a fantastic study of Colorado, and I sent him an email and said, why don't we replicate that for the United States? And Mike said, sure. And he drove that work. And I know in Fort Collins, you have built a very great example of an amenity-rich, both in terms of natural amenities and creative amenities economy, which will serve you well. We'll get to that. But what we found is that COVID-19 has had a devastating effect on the creative economy. It cost you, Colorado, 60,000 jobs. In the United States, it has taken 1/3 of all creative industry jobs. 1/3 of all those who work in the directly creative industries experience unemployment, and about half of all performing and visual artists, and a reduction of about 10% in wages, a devastating hit. But the point I want to make today is that the COVID crisis is not so much a disruptor and a fundamental shift in the way we live and work, in the way we undergo our daily lives, the way our communities respond, but an accelerator. And that's true of almost every pandemic and crisis I could look at in historical terms. These are really accelerators of changes already underway. And they create enormous space to rebuild and reimagine our communities in a different way. And what I want to suggest, echoing the mayor's comments about building back better, in a more inclusive, equitable, just, and resilient way, that this isn't only an opportunity, I would say it's our obligation. That what worries me, if you ask me what keeps me up at night, it's when I look back at the Spanish flu that occurred 1918, 1919, and I see what happened after the Spanish flu. Some people say, oh, it created great change in our society. We had the New Deal and we had the middle. No. The Spanish flu was followed by the freaking roaring 20s. One of the most equal, Great Gatsby, party time, lack of leadership errors in American history, the one we point to with our fingers now, and we don't want to be like that anymore. It took another generation, a Great Depression and World War, until we came to our senses. People call the Spanish flu the forgotten pandemic. As I mentioned, nobody told me about it. They wanted to push it in the background, my aunts and uncles. They didn't want to remember that stuff. Look, we need to keep this in our memory, in front of mind, and we need to be strategic and intentional about the way we recover. And that's what I want to talk to you about. How is it reshaping communities like Fort Collins, like big cities, like America's geography? What is our post-pandemic geography going to look like? The way I like to think about this, and the way I would like you to think about this, is it's not a one way or the other thing. There are a set of push and pull factors that have long acted on our geography and our communities, and COVID-19 affects both of them. Hard to say in advance how much. What most people have said is, oh, look, COVID-19 is really acting on these pull factors. It is really acting on, go back to the slide, it's really acting on the pull factors which pull people out to cities and rural areas. We've seen families move to suburbs. And I think, what COVID-19 has really done, even if you look at New York or San Francisco, which have seen the greatest outmigrations, it's caused families who have always moved to suburbs to do so more quickly. It's accelerated and compressed family formation moves that might have been delayed 1 or 2 or 3 years were made in 1 or 2 or 3 months. Look, I was born in 1957. When my brother came along in 1959, my parents were living in an apartment in Newark. They said, we have to move. They moved to a New Jersey suburb called North Arlington. So COVID-19 accelerates and compresses family formation moves, which are always the case. And remote work changes the nature of those moves. My parents, like most people of their generation, moved to a nearby suburb because my dad had to go to work every day in a factory in Newark, New Jersey. But now the rise of technology and the possibility of remote work changes that locational calculus. People no longer have to move, and I'll use my reference point of New York, New Jersey, to a New Jersey suburb or a Westchester County suburb or a Connecticut suburb. They can move to Tulsa, Oklahoma, Nashville, Tennessee, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Fort Collins, Colorado, Bozeman, Montana. If you're a high net worth New Yorker, Palm Beach or Miami Beach, Florida, because of the tax advantage. I could go on. But so remote work creates a different locational calculus for some subset of people. There is also a greater prevalence because public amenities are not as usable for private amenities like backyards and play areas, and increasingly a shift of people from suburban orientation, not only to other metros, but to rural areas. And this real interesting thing, which you've seen in Colorado, which they've seen in the Hudson Valley of New York, which they've seen in parts of California, but I think Colorado, California, and New York, and maybe Massachusetts have seen more of this than anywhere, this kind of move towards rural America and rural gentrification. And by the way, with Mike on the line, I would say that the creative class has had two kind of big orientations. One is it's always had a big urban orientation to places like Greenwich Village in the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s. But America's creative class has always had a strong rural orientation. The reason we had a Woodstock festival in 1969 was because artists and musicians had already populated Woodstock. And in fact, the guy they recruited to build that festival, Mike Lang, was building a music studio in Woodstock because the bands were already there. Bands like The Band, Bob Dylan, were already producing music. And they said, what if we had a music studio here for people to go to? The big shift, I think, and I'll come back to some others, the real big shift in the pandemic is remote work. I think that's the big disruptor. Before the pandemic, about 2% of Americans were working remote full-time. During the pandemic, about half to two-thirds of nearly all professional workers were working remotely. Now about a third of us. The surveys, and I'm very close with Adam Ozemek and of Upwork, we're probably going to write something together on this. The survey data that we have suggests that about 10 to 20%, more like 20%, a fifth of the workforce will be remote after the pandemic full-time, with another 15 to 30% of the workforce being part-time remote. That's almost half the workforce going remote at some part of the time. 10% of remote workers say they would consider a move, and nearly all of them want to go from a more expensive place to a less expensive place. And I think this is where Fort Collins has enormous opportunity, that I think that places that are ready to absorb remote workers, you mentioned the broadband initiative you're working on, that have the technology, that offer the amenities, that offer the lifestyle, the affordability, the cost and amenities. It's not just cost. One of the things we've seen in America is that amenities that used to just be available in big cities like New York and San Francisco, that 30 years ago were not available, even in Denver, never mind Fort Collins, are now available in communities across this country. And in fact, I would argue that there are better coffee shops, better restaurants, better access to live music in smaller places because they're easier to get around and more affordable than in bigger places now. And in bigger places, until this crisis hit, they were being replaced by chains. In New York City, when I walk around, there are no independent coffee houses. There's chain coffee houses, and go on. But I think initiatives like Tulsa Remote, I've worked very closely with Tulsa on this. I'm a consultant to the George Kaiser Family Foundation. This idea that Tulsa could rebuild an oil and gas economy by attracting remote workers. They offer a small stipend, but in addition to that stipend, embed people in the Tulsa community, help them find affordable housing, create co-working spaces they can go to, build a peer and co-working community, embed them, develop social and civic council in the community. Those are the things that really work. And you know, when I visit Tulsa, I can tell you, I see people from New York, from San Francisco, from Atlanta, from Chicago, from LA, who moved to Tulsa because of this remote work opportunity. But there's also push factors. Look, young people have always moved to cities in the wake of pandemics. Pandemics like the plagues in Europe that killed 30 to 40 to 50% of urban populations. Young people are drawn to opportunity. They're risk oblivious. We were young once. I always tell my wife now, if I was 19 or 22 years old, I'd be on the first bus or plane to New York City. I would be. To me, it looks fantastic. There are young people, there's street life, there's restaurants on the street, there's density, there's economic opportunity. Young people ages 25 to 34 have accounted for half the population increase in close-in urban neighborhoods of big cities since 2010. Clusters like high tech, finance, media, entertainment. If you want to start a career in those, you're going to go to the big city. And in fact, I believe that walkable, bikeable areas close to these clusters will increase in value as outlying areas decrease. The point is that the opportunity set is divided by demography. And the people who are going to look for affordability and outdoor recreation tend to be 35 and above and tend to be in the family formation level. If you're a young person, you can live with 4 or 5 other people, you can have roommates. And what we found is that people going after this talent group, the group that's most likely to make, I said this in my book, Who's Your City? There are 3 big moves we make. First move we make is after college or graduate school. That's a big city move to establish our career. The second move we make is not when we get married, it's when we form a family. And that's a move out of the big city, either to suburbs, but I think now to more attractive, amenity-rich places. Fort Collins is a good example. Bentonville could be another. Nashville. There are many of these. And then the third move we make is when the kids leave the house. And that's also a very attractive move for places like Fort Collins. I do think that in rebuilding our cities, artists and creatives will be key to this. I think that the folks who are going to help rebuild cities are going to be artists and creatives who have long been the folks that are driven to affordable space, who will head into dead retail space or dead office space or abandoned malls, all the carnage from remote work and offices, all the carnage from online delivery. And that's not just in cities. Artists and performing artists and visual artists can occupy these spaces in suburbs and rural areas and will, provided they have the opportunity. So I think a big part of the rebuilding effort will come from artists and creatives who are drawn, as they've always been, to affordable space. Well, how do we do this? What are some principles for building back better and generating a more inclusive and resilient economy? It's time, mayor, city manager, councilors, representatives, to put our eyes on the ball. We've been playing catch up for too long. We've been dealing with this debate about lockdown, public health capacity, and it's all important, but there are other people to put to work, people like me and Mike, others in the economic development community. We need to focus on economic recovery. We do this in the wake of natural disasters, hurricanes and fires. We need to do this now. We just built a big recovery strategy for Northwest Arkansas with the support of the Wharton Family Foundation. What's interesting here is I just went through the Menino survey of mayors that I think out now, or it's not, it's coming out. More mayors, significantly more mayors across this country see COVID as an opportunity to build back better. 45% then see it as a threat, with about a third being neutral. The fiscal impact and the budget cuts are the biggest potential threat, and they span all budget categories. They mean that we need to work with the federal government, but we have to coordinate and plan regionally and pool our resources, and we have to put inclusion and resilience front and center. This time is different. It's a unique moment to address these deep-seated issues of race and class. The composition of today's protest is very different than it was when I was a boy in the 1960s. It is much more multicultural and cross-class, and it's a historical moment for sweeping change. How do we do it? First principle, build complete communities. This is what urbanists now call 15-minute neighborhoods. The idea that we can do everything within a 15-minute walk or bike from where we live. That's how people are saying they want to live. That's what the shift to remote work is bringing us. We can get over this industrial revolution separation from work and life. We can reintegrate our lives. We can work and live in our communities. My neighborhood in Toronto, which was a dead, even though it's an urban neighborhood, the men would go to work during the day, and I would be the only male human being in my neighborhood going for a bike ride and walk, because I was always a remote worker. Now my neighborhood has come alive in Toronto. There are people walking and biking and visiting their neighbors. This idea that you can rebuild a community as a federation of 15-minute neighborhoods, Mayor Hidalgo in Paris has adopted this as her plan for Paris, and you can reduce commute times. People no longer need to be stuck on the road or in transit or on a train, stuck for 20, 30, 40 minutes an hour. They can work and live and more importantly, take their kids to school. We need to redesign the streets and open spaces. These are going to be big lasting changes from the pandemic. Look at these statistics. Mayor, from your colleagues across the country, 92% of mayors say they have created space for outdoor dining. Nearly half is closed from roads to traffic. 40% have widened some roads and sidewalks. We're not only going to put dining on the street. I've been talking to the leading office designers in New York. We're going to have to put work on the street. We're going to have windows that open that aren't hermetically sealed. We're going to have places for workers to go outside. The office is going to have to be redesigned less as a place, as a cubicle for work, but more as a set of experiences. we're now putting spinning classes outside, Soul Cycle. We're going to have to put schools out partly outside. Look, we're going to have a vaccine, but in the future, we're going to need, one of the things we've learned is that light and air really work. Ventilation and redesigning buildings, some of these buildings in some of these cities are going to have to come down. But we're going to redesign, even we can rework our parking lots and garages. I'm working with a company called Reef Technology, which is an aggregator of parking lots and parking spaces, to actually turn parking lots and parking spaces as parking for cars into neighborhood hubs for neighborhood markets, community kitchens, neighborhood activities, drive-in cinemas. So we have to rethink and redesign our streets and open spaces. We have to focus and prioritize the creative economy. We've already talked about Mike and I's findings. Mayors see the biggest long-term impact of any on the arts and the creative economy. We not only have to provide technical assistance, we have to provide business model assistance. We have to help them re-equip and plan. Artists and creatives are drivers of revitalization. We can develop platforms. Think about what the work you've done with the Bohemian Foundation. We're not going to have big Taylor Swift shows or Coachellas or Bonnaroos for a while. These are going to be down for a while. They'll be the last things to come back. Why not develop platforms, not only for online arts and culture, but so neighborhood groups can hire people, musicians, performers, theater groups, chefs, for socially distanced outdoor neighborhood block parties and activations. Why not put performers, especially in nice climates, on every street? Provide assistance and employment and work for those artists, but activate the community. Talent is the name of the game when it comes to economic development. Business attraction is over. We may see the occasional Tesla factory or ridiculous Amazon HQ2 competition. But what's interesting is remote work has made talent front and center in economic development. Why even go after business? It's a waste of money. Go after talent. I think the real change to economic development is talent, talent, talent. That the places that show they can attract talent, and not just young people, remote mid-career workers with families who would have been forced to look at the next door suburb before, but now have the wide open spaces. And not just focusing on the individual worker, working with big companies like Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, I can go down the list, Salesforce, to say, we will work with you to house remote workers in Fort Collins. Talent attraction and talent recruitment is the big name of the game. And look at initiatives like Tulsa Remote. Address racial and economic divides. Crisis hits hardest at the least advantage. I've already mentioned that. A focus on racial and economic equity and comprehensive community development for disadvantaged neighborhoods. It's high time we upgrade jobs for our frontline heroes. More than 70 million US workers work in low-wage service jobs, making a minimum wage, 25, 30 grand a year, spending more than half of that on their housing. 70,000 workers in Fort Collins, more than 40% of the workforce. They need higher wages and better working conditions. It's not enough just to give them a 20 or 25% tip on Instacart or whatever you use. We have to make their jobs better job. Hopefully, President-elect Biden will put this front and center, not just a $15 an hour minimum wage, but embracing a good job strategy. My dad, who worked in a factory, said he was paid a pittance in that factory when he went to work at age 13. It took 9 people, his father and mother, and his 6 siblings and him, to make a family wage. After the war, after his service in World War II, he came back to work in the same factory. And he had a good job, making a high wage, family supporting wage, could get married, have 2 kids, and buy a house. That was a good job strategy for manufacturing workers. We raised the wages so that they could buy the stuff that was coming off the assembly lines and create a middle class, move to the suburbs, buy homes, buy more stuff, and create this virtuous circle. We can do the same thing for a service worker, 70 million American heroes. Today, we can pay them higher wages. We can spend a little more for our deliveries. Look, we spent more for our cars and washing machines and clothes dryers and television sets. We can spend a little bit more for the people who take care of our kids and our ailing parents, for the stuff that gets delivered to us for our groceries, so that we can build a new middle class. We need to create more affordable housing, especially rental housing. We need to use all the tools at our disposal. And we need to engage our anchor institutions in inclusive prosperity. The great story of America's urban revival, which is unique, is that it was not just driven by government. It was driven by the private-public partnership and anchor institutions like Colorado State, like Rutgers, Newark, and NJIT in Newark, New Jersey, like the University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, like Drexel and Penn and Jefferson Medical Center in Philadelphia. It's an amazing story, which we see different story in every community, different way it's put together, but it's the same story. Mayors, by the way, in the Menino survey, see a significant long-term negative impact on colleges and universities, along with arts and culture. The two biggest threats they saw were on the colleges and universities and arts and cultural economies. Let's put anchor institutions at the center of this effort to build back better. Let's work side by side, communities and anchor institutions, to build a just and inclusive, resilient recovery. And we need to prioritize and plan for resilience. Not just future pandemics, but all sorts of natural disasters, climate change, wildfires. We need to put inclusion and resilience at the center of our look. We have a once in a century opportunity to build back better. We set in place a long run strategy. It's time to do it is now. That's why I'm so glad and happy you invited me to talk to you. We need to have all hands on deck in building that strategy for Fort Collins and other communities around the country. How do we build back a more creative, inclusive, just, and resilient economy? And as I said, it's not just our opportunity, it's our obligation to future generations to do that now. Thanks so much for listening, and I'm most excited about your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. And I'm going to turn it over to Jackie Kozak-Thiel to help moderate the conversation here. She's been moderating the chat box. So, Jackie?
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Florida and Mayor. So I think first we'll give an opportunity for our panelists here to ask some questions out loud in this kind of conversation space with Dr. Florida. And then I'm encouraging, we have over 100 attendees here that represent community leaders and partners from various regional governments, businesses, including lots from our creative class and our anchor institution, CSU, and other higher education, nonprofits, housing, philanthropy, our library, and more. There's lots of folks here, and it really does represent that Fort Collins approach of what you said, all hands on deck together to build back better. So we're so excited to be part of this conversation. We want to hear your questions. Please put them in the Q&A. And first, we'll see if any of our panelists here have some questions that, to start us off.
You know, Jackie, I'd like to kick off with one. And I completely agree that Colorado State University as an anchor institution is a key asset. We talk about we're a university community, not just town and gown, but really we're strategic. When we're aligned, the city, CSU, and so forth, we can actually move mountains that you can't do any other way, and really think of that partnership as an important one. You know, with the recovery of the pandemic, how do you see higher education changing? I mean, I'm on the faculty, and you know, we're doing all of our things remote now, and you can't do everything remote. You know, I have a design class and some other things. And so, you know, I think there's going to be some big impacts as it relates to higher ed.
So I agree, Mayor. I actually think the single biggest lasting disruption from the pandemic will be to education. The reason I say that, I think work will be huge and in many ways look bigger, but remote work was already here. It's just being accelerated. The pandemic has made remote education a reality. And I think it goes the gamut, K through 12 through higher ed. You know, we were mentioning before we went online that I taught my class on online, and it was tremendously successful. Mike visited. It was I got my highest teaching reviews ever. So yeah, I think it's going to impact a lot of higher education institutions negatively. Now, mainly it's not going to be Colorado State. It's going to be smaller institutions that are going to get whacked. But yeah, and it's going to change the nature of what we offer, and it's going to force us to do things more efficiently. I think it puts a premium on these partnerships that you mentioned, that because, and it's not just for, you know, it's funny. New York City is a college town. They finally realized this, you know, they finally realized the fact, oh, all these people coming to New York are coming here to college. So there are a lot of places in the United States that didn't think they were college towns that are. And I think this puts a premium on these partnerships that you've mentioned. And I would say to my colleagues, university-based colleagues, it means really understanding that the incentive system of our academic institutions needs to be geared to these kind of partnerships. Not just to research and publication and teaching, which are central, but also to encouraging and incentivizing these partnerships. And I will say this, every time I have tried to do these kinds of partnerships in the academic institutions I have been part of, I've been told to stop it. Not that there was a disincentive. I've been told, why are you talking to those mayors? Why are you talking to those council people? Why aren't you writing more papers? Why aren't you doing this? Let me tell you a story. Well, I was just promoted to university professor this year. And the person who wrote that packet, I got letters from mayors and governors and civic leaders. The person told me confidentially that all those were removed from my packet. Removed. Because they would have counted against me.
Mhm.
Now, I'm not saying Colorado State acts this way, and it probably doesn't. But the incentive change on the part of academic institutions now is imperative. And I think the disruption of the pandemic will force it.
Great story. Thank you.
Great. And next, I'm going to turn it over to Councilmember Emily Gorgel, who has a question for you.
Great, thanks, Jackie, and thanks, Dr. Florida, for coming. This was such a great presentation, and I think, sorry, my dog.
I have one too. Plus, I have 2 kids.
It's a fun time. So my
it.
question is that, you know, we've seen a lot of the things you said in your presentation, mainly about how race and wealth go hand in hand with COVID rates, and we've seen that here with our Latinx population. And I think one of the things that I worry about, and you briefly touched on, is that more people will be moving to cities like Fort Collins, I think, for the open space and the good quality of life. And one thing that worries me is that a lot of the people that will be moving have the luxury to work remotely, and probably for a company that pays a good wage. And we, like many cities, have an affordability crisis for housing in Fort Collins. So I guess if you could just talk about, you know, with more wealth moving to places like Fort Collins that are struggling with affordable housing, and an economy that's built on restaurant workers, which are often immigrants, and our Spanish-speaking population, and what you see for the future of that.
So I said this, the new urban crisis is coming to you. And I meant that as this age of remote work. I've said this a lot in my work in Bentonville. You know, Bentonville, which was a small town, home to Walmart, has now seen an explosion in natural amenities, biking, and it's seeing this influx. I've seen it in Tulsa. And that the new urban crisis the old urban crisis was a crisis of urban failure and people moving out. The new urban crisis is a crisis of urban success. It's people saying, I want to live there. It's a great place. It has wonderful amenities. It has outdoor things. It has arts and culture. When people move in, they drive up prices. So what I've been cautioning communities like Fort Collins is to plan for this in advance and don't get caught like San Francisco or New York or Seattle did. And it's not just a question of affordability. It's a political challenge. You know, I did a Zoom with folks in New York yesterday. And I said, people are really angry. I mean, I'm a working class kid. They see the rich people in New York who are living in penthouses, protected, or townhouses, or living in the Hamptons or in rural Hudson. And they're taking transit and going to work and putting their lives on the line. Yeah, they're mad. And they want political change. They're saying, well, our mayoral candidates are to the left. Of course. I mean, people are really scared. Makes sense. So the political challenge is very real. So that, I think, means it's in your interest to embrace these ideas of affordability, inclusion. And I think it's not, so one, affordable housing, inclusionary zoning, all the tools you have to mandate that those are created, providing land, subsidizing development, however you can, working with the federal government, but also the demand side, making sure that people have adequate wages, and the good job strategy, adopting a strategy that people are paid a living and decent wage. So I think the communities that are able to do that are the ones that are going to be viewed, because I think people are going to get nervous. If they don't see inclusion at the center of this, even talented people will go, ooh, I'm not sure I want to live there. That community has its trouble. So yeah, I think it's something that's going to affect all of our communities, especially attractive communities like Fort Collins.
Thank you. Next, we have a question from our Mayor Pro Tem, Kristen Stevens.
Thank you. Well, good morning, and thank you for coming to speak to us. This has been a really great talk. I feel really energized after talking to you. You talked a little bit about racial equity, and so beyond the economic piece of that, which Emily kind of touched on that, what else can we do? And I've always been a believer that the university can do more in this space to help us with this issue. So, you know, I feel like exposing young children to, I mean, we have this big research university in our community, and yet who could do all kinds of really creative, innovative programming to get kids interested in tech and arts. And I feel like there's still such a divide there. So that's my own aside, but what else can we do? We have a small working group that's working on the racial equity issue, but what more do you think we can do in that space beyond the economic piece?
So before the crisis hit, we did 3 big strategies on this. One for Denver, which I'm happy to send you, for Mayor Hancock, who was concerned about this for institutional reasons, but also personal reasons, the way he grew up and everything. We did one for Newark, and we did one for Philadelphia. The Denver one is actually, in this case, less interesting for you. The Philadelphia and Newark ones are more. In Newark, what we found is that the anchor institutions, New Jersey Institute of Technology, which is the technical college, engineering college, and Rutgers Newark, basically with support from the Prudential Foundation, saved Newark. These universities took on the task of rebuilding a city that had become an economic disaster zone. Majority minority, largely Black, a city that was seeing tragic infant mortality rates, high levels of crime and violence. And the university became front and center. In Philadelphia, which may be the most, because I think it's not an analogous situation, but it's somewhat similar. The University of Pennsylvania, Drexel, the University of Science Center, Thomas Jefferson Medical College said, look, we have to revitalize Philadelphia because Philadelphia is struggling like crazy. It's not booming like Fort Collins or Denver. But we have to put equity at the center, and we have to rebuild communities. So, for example, what they did is not only, well, one, they built a public charter school, not a private school for faculty members, but a public charter school. But they developed neighborhood improvement programs. So they said, we're not only going to give assisted loans to faculty members, we're going to make those assisted loans available to community members. We're going to build public amenities. When we build a health center, it's not just going to be a faculty health center, it's going to be a community health center. So everything they did, and now because that town gown crisis there is even accentuated, they've doubled down on that. Better job pathways, better ways of educating, hiring more people from the community and giving them actual jobs and better jobs. But I think it goes right to the nature of that partnership. I can tell you from folks from Colorado, universities are legitimately scared of this. And I don't want to put them off the hook, but I just want to make it clear. The university leadership is saying, we're not a social service organization. We heard this in Philadelphia and Newark. Look, we're willing to do our part, but we can't do the government's job. And just because the Trump administration, has taken all of this social assistance away, we can help, but we can't replicate it. But I do think if we recognize what each other can do, we can have a partnership. One thing I will say, as a distinguished fellow at NYU, I was the recipient of university housing, subsidized university housing. I don't have it anymore because we don't live in New York. We have kids and we've got too much of a hectic. That's housing is subsidized for professors, but not for frontline workers. I mean, universities need to think, and I've been encouraging them, maybe it's time to think in a different way. You've been subsidizing housing so that faculty can live in this town. Maybe it's time to think about partnership, city, community, federal, state partnership, where you can provide housing for other parts of the community, including the people who work for you.
Great, thank you so much. And there's a lot of themes around, so I'm glad we were able to ask some questions. There's a lot of themes in the questions around inclusive and intentionality with our communities. And we'll try to get to as many as we can. We might not be able to get to all of them, but one of the themes that came up too was a lot of questions around the 15-minute neighborhood that you talked about, Dr. Florida, and a question around how do we navigate the polarity between regionalism, which I think all the attendees here speak to our regional approach and the need for that, but also looking towards the 15-minute neighborhood. And just, can you speak more to this, and also how we might repurpose unused commercial space and how retail and other industries will change with the 15-minute neighborhood?
I actually think those two things are kind of flip sides to the same coin. So I'm glad you asked them together. And by the way, I don't have to jump off right at the hour. Others probably, those have to, but I don't. So if people want to stay on a little longer, I can, if you want. If not, I can answer questions offline. I think this idea of regionalism and the 15-minute neighborhood go together. And I think what we're seeing now is that we used to have working areas and living areas. And there was a place people commuted to work, and then a place of dormitory or bedroom communities where they went to reside. And that's fading. And let's applaud that. Let's say it's time that went away, that people now have the capability to integrate their life and to spend more time with their kids and to spend more time with their family and to spend more time with their neighborhoods and to build social capital. So I think the principle should be every neighborhood in a metropolitan area should be as close to possible as a 15-minute neighborhood. That means within a walking or biking of your house, you can do just about everything you need to do. Take your kids to school, go to the doctor, go shopping, get everything you need to do within a 15-minute. That will make the environment better. That will get rid of these heinous commutes. I think the big question in the United States is not just work, it's education. You know, certainly when I look at the difference in Toronto is in my neighborhood in Toronto, and I live in a city, I could walk my kids to 5 schools. 2 public schools, a Catholic school, which is provincially supported, and several private schools. And most people, especially for elementary school in Toronto, use in Miami Beach, where we are now. I mean, and it's a much smaller community. People are driving an hour to 45 minutes. So that just tells me something. In New York City, my friends who live in New York, kids are commuting 45 minutes to an hour. People in LA, good luck. So I think this idea, and the problem with the 15-minute neighborhood is that, and this came out, I looked at the Q&A just briefly, is that it's usually advantaged white people who have the income and opportunity to live in them. If we thought about food deserts for less advantaged Latin and Hispanic and African-American people, they're the folks who are least likely to live in a 15-minute neighborhood and more likely to depend on a bus or a subway to get to work. So I think we have to put inclusion at the center of this effort to build them. But I do applaud Mayor Hidalgo in Paris, who says, look, this is going to be look, can we make every neighborhood a 15-minute neighborhood? No. But can we get on track to start to move there? Yeah. And I think that's a regional thing. It's not just a Fort Collins thing. It's a metropolitan-wide thing.
Thank you. And thanks for looking through the questions too. There's a lot of great ones from our attendees, and thanks for being willing to stay on past the hour, because clearly there's a lot that folks are interested in talking with you about. I think I'll go to our Chief Human Resource Officer, Teresa Roche, next, who had a question for you.
Dr. Florida, thank you again for being here. And you had me at hello when you talked about talent. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, when you talk about the word resilient, one of the things we've discussed is that the talent pipeline at all levels, all types of positions, that there's a mental health crisis. Yep. COVID has exacerbated it. And so I wonder if you have any thoughts about, given the reality of our current workforces and who is coming in, how do we address that so that we truly speak to the resilient part?
So first of all, I think we need a big postmortem on how we've handled this crisis. I think the mental health implication has been horrendous, and it's been brushed under the rug. And now I'm going to tell you a story, Teresa. I've never had anxiety in my life. I'm not an anxious person. When this pandemic came, I called my family doctor and I said, can you prescribe me anti-anxiety medication? He said, no, I'm not going to do it. It's too addictive. And I don't know if he was telling me the truth. He said, I'll give you a simple sleeping pill. And by the way, I was saying, I was a big drinker. I decided to stop drinking because I knew it was bad for anxiety. When I look at, I think San Francisco, somebody published this number, just in terms of overdose deaths, there's been twice the number of overdose deaths than deaths from COVID. Now, I don't know if that number is right, but when you look at the mental health implications of the kind of work we do, then take COVID and isolation and remote work, Lord God, we've got to focus on this. And the young people's suicides, these kids, look, I have kids, my kids are 3 and 5. Finally, my wife and I said, we have to start taking them to the playground. Like, yeah, there's a risk they're going to get this darn virus, but the bigger risk is they're going to go batshit. Sorry. I mean, you could just see on a 3 and a 5-year-old, they talk about the impacts of the Spanish flu, the whole positive psychology movement that we know about embracing kids and holding kids, and comes from the survivors of the Spanish flu whose parents were afraid to hold them. You're 100% right that when we're talking about resilience, mental wellness, mental health has to be at the center of it. And with this wellness movement that we have, we need to extend it and expand it. It's not just about physical fitness and looking good. It's about feeling good and finding purpose and meaning in your life. So I'm 100% believer on it. I've acted on it in my own personal life, but there's a whole lot more we can be doing for people and communities.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you so much. So another question, and then we'll probably go to a, at the hour, a soft close for folks who need to go, and then, a continuation with the generous Dr. Richard Florida for any unanswered questions. So one kind of last question together in our plenary, I'll do a soft close, and then we'll transition to that kind of after hours dialogue too. So this is from our audience. You've spoken about the importance of both anchor institutions and artistic entrepreneurs to the post-pandemic city. Often in the creative sector, these two groups find themselves at best disconnected and at worst at odds. How can these disparate groups work together to energize our communities?
Well, I think the increasing recognition that we're in it together. And, one characteristic of our modern society is to pit group against group. And, one of the good things I think that's happening is that when people no longer need so much office space or no longer need so much retail space, they're going like, well, what am I going to do with this? Well, artists. Artists can take that over. Nobody else wants it. So maybe, Jesse Elliott, your own Jesse Elliott, told me a fantastic story when he was at the University of Iowa, when he created something with his colleague called the James Gang. They went to the university and to civic leaders and said, we want to create incubation space for civic action, for social action, for artistic and creatives. And the people who were running that, whether they were academic leadership or civic, said, no, that's for tech entrepreneurs. Well, duh, there's the problem. We need to broaden. That's why I came up with this idea of the creative class, as silly as it was 20 years ago. The idea that we're all using our creative faculties, if you will, to engage ourselves in purposeful and meaningful ways, and that we're all in a way equal. And so for the artist, for the creator, for the musician, for the entrepreneur, we all want a space in which to actualize. And actually, when I wrote that book, not just doing stuff we love, but doing it in a space that was motivating was really important. So now I think when commercial and retail spaces become more affordable or underutilized or abandoned, the time to do that is now. And to make that broad, it's not just about tech entrepreneurs and startups. It's about incubating and supporting artistic and creative and innovative endeavor across the board. And I think what I found in communities that do that, like Newark put a prevalence on artistic and creative and tech entrepreneurship, but with a real focus, this is really interesting, on women and minorities. Made that a centerpiece, not an afterthought. They said in Newark, again, a relatively disadvantaged community, we're going to put women creative, innovative entrepreneurship and minority creative, innovative entrepreneurship at the center, not as an offshoot. And it helped. Not saying it solved all of this. There's always going to be some division, but it helped. So I think you've got to be intentional about it.
Well, thank you so much. I know we're at 9, so this is our soft close. All are welcome to join us for the bonus after hours with Dr. Richard Florida. But just for those that need to move on, I want to thank our over 100 folks from our regional community who have participated and attended this session. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. And I'm so grateful for how many of the key themes that I saw in the questions you already wove in this dialogue and in your presentation, Dr. Florida. So thank you. And what I might just, leave us all with is what I know I'm going to be reflecting on a lot is what you kind of were saying in terms of this is a once in a lifetime opportunity and obligation to build back better. And that is really focusing on inclusive, equitable, just, and resilient cities. And so just thank you so much. And for those of you that have to go, have a great rest of your day. And again, we welcome all to stay for additional Q&A. So just a quick, while we're all together, thank you for your time, Dr. Florida.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Okay, so Dr. Florida, I don't know how much more time you are able to spend with us. And if there was any questions in particular, I know you've been monitoring the Q&A too that you wanted.
I think I have at least 10 to 15 minutes and maybe more. So.
Okay, great. So So maybe I'll start with, I'll help click through the Q&A and encourage folks to continue putting in there. And also if any panelists are staying on, please feel free to chat me or to raise your hand if you want to ask a question. But I think continuing on that question, we talked about the polarity of regionalism and 15-minute neighborhood, and knowing that we have so much regional representation with us today. Can you speak a little bit more about how regionalism will support our recovery and building back stronger for the future cities, especially in a strong university town like Fort Collins?
Well, you know, if I was advising President-elect Biden, I would say make the bailout contingent on regional cooperation. That's how strongly I feel that if you're going to need fiscal assistance, and we know that there's some service duplication, there's fragmentation, mayors and city managers deal with this all the time, and they're political constraints. I would say, you know, and the United States is a good example. That as much as I was a critic of the Amazon HQ2 incentives, the regional cooperation that ensued across this country, where cities and suburbs and communities, Detroit and Windsor worked together across a national border to put together a regional plan. I think, yeah, and for all of you, doing more with less in a fiscally acute fiscal crisis, if you will, makes good sense. So I would say now is the time, and it doesn't mean you have to become one regional government. That's not what I mean by any means. It means working together to do things as efficiently as possible while maintaining political independence, and thinking about that, what's in everybody's mutual interest. Because we are going to be living in a region. A region is an economic engine. The bigger we are, the bigger the economic engine. It's a labor market. It's a talent market, business recruitment market. So yeah, I just think it makes great sense in an era of declining budget resources, revenues, to pool. And I would encourage you to do that. I know Colorado has done better on this, you know, than most places. Colorado actually has done better on regionalism than a lot of other places. One thing to look at, you know, is in Pittsburgh, where I lived for 20 years, they created a regional asset district. They didn't do there were lots of municipalities, or hundreds of municipalities in greater Pittsburgh, but they created a regional asset district where they pooled some revenues from certain kinds of taxes, whether they were hospitality, tourism, whatever they were, for big ticket items, whether that was a stadium or a convention center, whatever a cultural venue. So yeah, I think thinking about regionally the time to do that is now.
Great, thank you so much. And that's definitely been a focus. And like you said, we have a history of that in Colorado. So I think I'm going to combine two of the questions that I'm seeing from the audience. And it's about reflecting on your comments related to amenities, and that, you know, in the past, economic development was about creating great places. And now, you know, do we think that's shifted to great amenities? And how do we, you know, what is the role of defining values in communities? And then combining that too, of thinking that as we think about the community, the 15-minute community, and all those amenities together, and the integration of work and life, knowing that, you know, we can't build our way out of the problem, and that affordable houses are not enough, and that we need intentional communities as well. And so any advice for us as we think about the role of values, intentionality in building these communities of the future?
Yeah, I think that the American public, the slide I put up where I said this time is different, a cross-class, cross-racial, white, I mean, look at the composition of those protests. Look at how white and professional class they were, as well as Black and Latino. That's telling you something. And look at the number of young people who said, this is something I want to devote my life to. You know, I teach those kids. We see it in an MBA program. So America is demanding. Americans are demanding, or at least a large swath of Americans are demanding, that we become more purposeful with regard to values and put inclusion and justice at the center. And I think it's incumbent upon us to do it in a way that says we can do it in a way that we're going to grow. Because if not, these become tensions. We don't want to fall into that, where we say we can either do equity or growth. We can either have a bigger economy or more. That's not true. We can have a bigger economy and a better economy and more jobs and a more equitable economy. Scandinavia shows us that's actually possible. So that's what we need to do. We can't devolve into this, you know, the spiral of it's equity or growth. There has to be both together. So I think our values, our spoken values and our public policy values have to put inclusion and equity at the center of everything we do. And not just mouth those words, but make sure that we act on them. And I think we're going to get, I mean, look, the past 4 years haven't been the best in our history. But I think it was pretty clear. The Americans sent a pretty clear signal that we want to get back to normalcy. We want to get back to decency. And we understand that equity and inclusion are important. And we want to do it also in a meritocratic way. We don't want to do it in a way that those are just the things we focus on. So that's going to be the great challenge of our future. How do we put those things together? But I don't think Fort Collins should abandon what it's doing. I think this focus on amenity, on arts and culture, on natural amenity is critical. Just that those things have to be, and other things have to be provided in an inclusive way. They can't look like, or it should not be things that are just for one group versus another. And I think we have to make all of these open and essential services open to everybody.
Thank you for that. And we often talk about the Fort Collins and here. And so really I saw the, saying that can be equity and, economic prosperity, that these don't need to be mutually exclusive. And so how do we support both? So another question is, we also are a community that has a lot of values around the triple bottom line. So economic, environmental, and social health. So on the relationship between economy, consumerism, and climate change, I'm interested to hear your thoughts how we might shift local economies to support systemic health across natural, social, and economic.
I think you just answered the question. I think that for most Americans, climate change is an abstract thing. But healthier, safer communities isn't. And so the pandemic becomes the thread to pull and say, look, we want a community that's healthier and more safer. Resilience is a big word. So this won't happen again. And we won't be going through this again in 5 or 10 years. And we need to be safe and healthy across the board. And your family needs to be healthier and safer. So while I applaud all the efforts on climate change, and as a country, we're going to double down on those again, I think we have to make it more immediate. I like this triple bottom line, but I like making it very immediate to people. You want to live in a safe community. You want to live in a healthy community. You want your kids not to grow up in a polluted environment. You don't want wildfires to be, burning down your community. You want to live in a better place. And I think we have to make it plain. Sometimes we talk in public policy in 2 big words. And I think we just have to put inclusion and resilience, health, safety, and inclusion together. That's what I think we have to shift the conversation. That's not going to happen overnight. Look, we've had 20, 30 years of a different kind of conversation. Now we're going to have to shift the conversation gradually in this direction.
Thank you for that too, and the focus on health, which has definitely been top of all of our minds this year. So another question that was earlier, you mentioned the good job strategy and knowing that there's, political reality and work to do at a national level, but maybe could you speak to a little bit about advice at the local level when you think about the good job strategy and, supporting jobs that are part of this inclusive, just, equitable, and resilient community of the future?
Well, here's an area where I've been fighting an uphill battle, and I think communities have not done enough. This does not have to be a national initiative. That community by community, if I look back at how we build a high-tech startup economy or how we rebuilt our manufacturing economy in the 1980s, we started these networks. They called it the Manufacturing Extension Network. They began to bring together community by community good manufacturers that would teach the other manufacturers that they could create better processes, better systems, use better equipment, engage their workers better, pay them more. We saw this in the high-tech move in Pittsburgh. We created a high-tech council where companies work together to level each other up. Well, communities can go to their service industries and say, look, we want to have a summit. We want to put together a coalition, a network of service businesses so you all can learn how to do things better. Many communities have big service businesses. When we work in Tulsa, there's a company called Quick Trip, which is this kind of quick convenience store, which embraces the good job strategy, which pays its workers more, which engages them in their work, which lowers its turnover, which gets higher productivity and gets higher profits. You can take employers like that and help them work with small mom and pop businesses and help them learn the benefits of a good job strategy. You have the power, at least in some, to begin to encourage raises in the minimum wage. You can do it for public officials. and public sector workers. So I think there's a range of ways that communities can say, and I think educating, there is this thing called the good job strategy. It works, it's proven. It's not just paying people more and getting less. It's actually paying people more because they're more innovative, they're more engaged, they're more committed, there's less turnover. It's a double, triple bottom line. It drives up your productivity, it drives up your profit. So yeah, I think communities can start that conversation and build those networks.
Great. Another wonderful question that came in, which speaks to the challenges that we've all been facing in the last year and how those challenges are being lived out in our communities and the pressures and the disparities that are being exacerbated during this time. Is how important do you think that civility is to the future of our cities? And what does civility look like in the future? And how do we support cultivating that?
I think this goes back to Teresa's question about mental health. I think that this instability and constant change, I've always said that the main injury of the knowledge or creative economy is no longer repetitive. It's no longer back or leg injury that wasn't a factory. It's mental injury, that we are stressing the human mind and human cognitive functions in ways that were unimaginable a century ago. And stability is an important part. And I think actually when people are looking to move out of the big hectic city, a big reason they're looking to move is not just affordability, it's some kind of stability. A stability that comes from knowing your neighbors, knowing the shopkeeper, knowing the mayor, knowing your council person, that not this anonymous life. I think a big part of what people are looking for is some kind of community stability. Look, I mean, we're all part of this. We all feel it. We see it in our kids. We see what happens when they don't have stability. So yeah, I think developing strategies which maintain, we call it social or civic capital, let's call it what it is, stability, in a very disrupted, constantly disrupted world. And especially where in Fort Collins, a lot of your people are newcomers, right? A lot of people coming to Fort Collins are coming there for the first time. Stability is really important.
Thank you. I just love that concept of how we're investing in community stability as part of the future of our resilience too. So I know we've kept you past time, so I think the last question we'll have for you, there's still over 70 people here, and I think that just speaks to one of our greatest assets in Fort Collins. Something someone once said to me was, Fort Collins is large enough that you can do anything, which speaks to kind of the creative part of the DNA here, but small enough where people really care. And, I think that reflects why there's still so many people on the line, that folks really care. And so knowing that, your parting advice for us as a community who really cares about the future of our community, is working together at a local and regional scale about this future, is committed to making the future more inclusive, just, resilient, and equitable. Parting advice for us.
So I would start a recovery strategy today, a real recovery strategy from COVID-19 and the pandemic. And, I would begin to think that through and develop a set of task force or committees looking at areas like talent, innovation, creativity, inclusion, stability, all the stuff we talked about. And I would, not put the frontline public health people on that, but I would put people like us on that and say, look, we partnered with the university, with community groups, with civic groups, chamber-like groups. We need a strategy over the next 3 to 5 years, what we will look like post-pandemic, and what we want to be with regard to how we grow our economy, how we attract talent, how we stay affordable, how we stay stable, how we stay resilient, how we become equitable. And I would make this a community-wide recovery strategy. I've been saying, I think this is what communities are failing to see, that there is a recovery from this, a part of which is physical and part of it which is mental and emotional. And the more in which we think ahead, we can't map that out completely, but the more we kind of plan for that, the better. The other thing I think that's an important component is that you do have an ability to attract talent now, and I would go for that. I would do like a moonshot and say, when you think about things like the Bohemian Foundation in Colorado State, I would say, like, what is the talent we really want and need in Fort Collins? And in the way we used to go after businesses, how do we go after that? Like, so many people have become unmoored by this. And, there are so many people looking at options I'm close to New York, right? Because I grew up in New Jersey. I've never heard New Yorkers talk like, well, I might move to XYZ. Never. But it's all anyone wants to talk about. Where should I go? What should I look at? What place should I be looking at? What place would be best for me, for my family? And Colorado in general has appeal, right? It has appeal. So I would be thinking in terms of recovery, front and center, what would my talent, if I had, all the resources I could, what would be the kind of talent I would be looking to attract to Fort Collins, and how would I be going after that? And, I might indeed partner with the governor's office, the state, other metropolitan areas, your federal delegation to say, look, especially what might we be thinking of, and really thinking about economic development in this new and different way, about this combination of talent and equity. But I think, plan for equity and inclusion, but really think now in the here and now, because it's so immediate. Talent. And what could I, it's almost like, well, I'm going to go after an Amazon thing. I'm going to go after no, think about, the 10 to 100 people who, if they move to Fort Collins, would make a big difference in the future of Fort Collins. I think you have that kind of opportunity now. By the way, it's been a pleasure seeing you all again. I'm easy to reach. My email's florida@creativeclass.com. Michael knows it, and he knows how responsive I am on email. If you have any further questions, if I didn't get to your question, feel free to reach out. And you gave me you've given me great inspiration by talking to all of you and seeing your commitment to your community. It's a time that needs this now. So thank you so much for inviting me to be part of it.
Well, thank you so much. And I received more text than I could even read about how awesome this was, and how people just, this was so inspirational. And so thank you for the real impact you have already had and are having on our community. And thank you everyone for spending this morning dedicated to a conversation about the future of our community.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Good stuff.